Well, hello, welcome to the video. This one's about 6 bands from the 1970s that were punk, art rock or whatever, just plain old good, who could have made it huge but never actually did. Well, let's not mess around, let's get on with it. And the first band we're going to talk about is the Kursaal Flyers.
That's another reason I'm not out there on that train.
Now, you may have heard the Kursaal Flyers because they had one hit single, which was She Knows That You Know That They Know That We Know That He Knows That, well, you know the one.
Little does she know that I know that she knows that I...
The Kursaal Flyers were formed in 1973 in Southend, Essex. The key members of the band were Paul Shuttleworth, who was the vocalist, Vic Collins, Richie Bull, Graham Douglas, who went on to great things, I'll talk about that later, Will Birch on drums, who wrote the book No Sleep Till Canvey Island, and Dave Hatfield on double bass. Dave Hatfield was quite well known because he owned a record shop called Projection Records in Leigh-on-Sea, which was the go-to place for all the obscure stuff, and he ran a mail order company upstairs. And I've got to thank Steve Hooker, who's another Southend music legend, for this information, because a lot of people think that Projection Records was Barry Martin, who went on to play guitar in the Kursaal Flyers, but more of that again later, because this time the guitarist is Graham Douglas. Anyway, Dave Hatfield owned this and Barry Martin worked in the shop. They had connections with Dr. Feelgood, so when Dr. Feelgood played various gigs in London, they tagged along as the support act. And after a while, they were discovered by the very famous Jonathan King, who I suppose was the Simon Cowell of the day. Everyone knew who Jonathan King was. He had TV programs. He ran a record label, he was a producer, he had hits, all kinds of things. So he was very well known. Went on to spend time in jail for sexual offences. But anyway, enough about Jonathan King. He found the Kursaal Flyers, and I think they did 2 albums with him and then various singles, and then they signed to CBS Records. In 1975, the BBC made a documentary about the Kursaal Flyers, where they followed them on the road for a while, and it's quite a famous one if you want to see. I think it's on YouTube, and they basically filmed them doing gigs and recording and that sort of thing. When they were with CBS, they were pushed to become more commercial. Basically, that's when Graham Douglas left the band, and Barry Martin, who was the guy who worked in the record shop run by Dave Hatfield. Dave had already gone by this stage because he left due to pressure of work. So by this time, if we're talking 76, 77, they're getting more commercial. Graham Douglas goes and joins Eddie and the Hot Rods, for whom he wrote a few hit singles, by the way. I think I mentioned the date though, didn't I? 76, 77. And like so many bands at that time, along came punk and it swept all before it. And unfortunately, one of the things it swept before it was the Kursaal Flyers, and they broke up. But they did reform in the 1980s twice. I put them on at the Cricketers because by this time I was working with Steve Hooker, the aforementioned, and Dave Hatfield, who was by this time was also running a record label, and they'd got Wilco Johnson, and I think Lou Lewis and Steve Hooker and people like that on the label. So we worked together on things at various times. And also he brought over a guy called Flaco Jimenez from Texas, because he was a Tex-Mex superstar who played the accordion. So it's all very I keep saying that, don't I? I must stop saying that. So it's all great stuff. And in the 80s, I put them on, and Dave Hatfield had rejoined. I don't think Graham rejoined. He might have done, but I don't recall. So anyway, they were really good, and they just did a few shows for me. And unfortunately, punk did for the Kursaal Flyers. There you go. And the next band I'm going to talk about is The Boys. A different kettle of fish, because the Boys, well, they formed in October 1975 when Matt Dangerfield, who was a singer-songwriter, played guitar. He was in Mick Jones and Tony James's fledgling punk band London SS. They were like a super band of the time, except they didn't actually record, so no one really knows what London SS sounded like. Obviously, the name was meant to shock, but anyway, forget this, we're talking about Matt Benchfield, and he joined it with a guy called Casino Steel, who played keyboards. They were one of the best songwriting duos. They were called the Lennon-McCartney of punk, and they wrote some fantastic songs. Signed to NEMS Records, which, as you know, was basically NEMS means Northeast Music Stores, which is Brian Epstein's record stores, which all connected all this, you know, all these people owning influential record shops. Well, they signed, Brian Epstein was long dead, and they formed a record label. They were very active in the punk era, and so they signed the Boys, and the Boys did, I think, the first album came out the same day as the Sex Pistols album. I think it might have been certainly the same week. And so that was overshadowed by that. I think they were the first punk band to sign to an album deal. So I'm not sure whether theirs came out first, or it was a matter of hours, I think, between theirs coming out and the Sex Pistols. Of course, the Sex Pistols got all the press and all the stuff. The first gig was in the Hope and Anchor, and in the audience was Billy Idol and Joe Strummer and Mick Jones and Gene October, who's the lead singer of Chelsea, in case you've forgotten. And it was like, you know, everybody who was anybody in that sort of scene was there. I wasn't. I saw them quite a bit later, 1980, I think, in the Music Machine, which later became the Campton Palace and is now called Coco. And they were great. I mean, their songs were like, absolutely, it was power pop at its best, even though we didn't know what power pop was back then. And they should have been quite big. They were a lot bigger, funny enough, on Sur la Continent, as Jamie Young, the DJ, used to say, because they were big in Germany. And after they broke up, there's a band called Die Hosen. I should put their name anyway. They were a famous German punk band. And they, basically, their whole set for a while was all the Boys songs. So there you go. That's how good they were. But now no one knows who the Boys are. Isn't that sad? That's just the opposite to the Kursaal Flyers, isn't it? Well, in a way, you know what I mean. At this point, could I just say, if you're liking this, you've got to press that like button, because you've got no idea how good that is for the algorithm, because the algorithm should be my friend, but for some reason, I'm not really getting on at the moment. And you can help by subscribing too. I don't know if you're aware of this, but by the simple act of pressing the subscribe button and the notification bell, you're probably extending your life by up to 4 years. Now, this is not scientifically proved, it's just my theory. So give it a go. What have you got to lose? Press that subscribe button and the notification bell, and share it with your friends, or indeed anybody that you can think of. It's good. And let's get back to the bands. And who's the next one we're going to talk about? Well, it's the Doctors of Madness. Richard Kid Strange. Back in 1974, when Richard Strange formed the Doctors of Madness, there were some very strange things happening. I mean, the Doctors of Madness were a band like none other. I think I can say that quite safely. I thought they were great, actually. If you can imagine, like David Bowie and the Velvet Underground mixed in with a bit of pre-punk aggression, that is Doctors of Madness. They played a first gig in West Hampstead, and then they did a residency at the Cabbage Patch at Twickenham, which is like, I think that was because it was a bit off the circuit, but it was still on the circuit. I think they did it for 4 or 5 weeks, and every week the audience doubled, which was something that happened back then. If it didn't happen, residencies had a habit of being curtailed. But this one, it doubled every week. Word of mouth was a thing back then, because everybody went to gigs and they talked to each other. Have you seen this band? Have you seen that band? And the word of mouth about then got down the manager of Pink Floyd, Brian Morrison, who was in partnership at the time with a guy called Justin de Villeneuve, who was a former hairdresser and best known as manager of the model Twiggy. His name was Nigel Davis. He was an East End hairdresser who called himself something, again, like a weird name when he was hairdressing, and then he changed his name again. But he was Brian Morrison's partner, and he took a real shine to this band before they signed a record deal or anything. Justin Earle and Brian Morrison got together a party, a launch party for the Doctors of Madness, and apparently everybody who was anybody in London society was there, from Mick Jagger, you know, various Beatles, all sorts of things, movie stars, and apparently Justin Denerville was very upset because Warren Beatty said he'd come and he never did. But there was Sophia Loren there and Peter Sellers and people like that. So it's a real exciting bash. I wasn't there, needless to say, but you know, this is the sort of thing that was happening back then. This is like, you know, again, pre-punk. Eventually they signed to Polydor Records and they were pushing out some amazing stuff. I think they did 3 albums for Polydor. And the live show was the thing. I saw them live several times and they were absolutely amazing. As I say, it was like nothing you'd expect. If they'd done all the punk bands at the time, the big punk bands that were to be, like the Sex Pistols, the Damned, the Clash, everybody supported the Doctors of Madness. It seemed like a good fit. So they were like seen as avant-garde and, well, halfway to punk. Richard Kid Strange, because his stage name was Kid Strange. They all had weird stage names. And one of their things was they had a fiddle player. I'm a bit of a sucker for bands that have fiddle players or violin players, and they were one of the best. Apparently they did a show in the northeast somewhere, Durham I think, where the Sex Pistols slaughtered them. And Kid Strange says that when he watched the Sex Pistols, he knew basically at that point that it was all over for them, because this is going to be the future. And the Sex Pistols were in their dressing room, rifling through their pockets and stealing all their money. So that's a cautionary tale.
Let that be a lesson to you, you mutts!
The punk thing happened. They basically had one album left to do on the deal with Polydor. Polydor gave them less money than they said they were going to give them. No record company support, and so they broke up. In the meantime, he's done some amazing things, Richard Strange. So Richard Strange and I are still Facebook friends even for this day. He is somebody that, no matter what he did, I always went out of my way to go and watch it. Doctors of Madness reunited for a one-off performance in 2014 at the South Bank Centre when Kid Strange, Richard Strange, put together an all-day thing, which was a multimedia event, which was called Language is a Virus from Space, I think, which is a collection of stuff, that's not the right word, is it? A collection of art on William Burroughs, and they played there. And about a month later, Stoner, who was their original bass player, he died of cancer, so that's all very sad. But they've since done an album, I think, a new album, which I've not heard, and there's been odd things here and there. Richard Strange always does things, and it's always worth watching out when he does things.
Of course I'll keep a watch out for him.
The next photo about it's the Winkies.
Just take my hand and let's go. How long?
Now the Winkies started off as a pub rock band. They looked like they just stepped off the cover of a Roxy Music album. They were very art rock, I'd say that. It was interesting music. I did see them a few times, and they were picked up by Brian Eno, who made them his backing band. And so they went on the road with him, but unfortunately he had something wrong. I think he had a collapsed lung, so the tour was curtailed, and they went back to playing in pubs. This was 1974, I believe. And the main guy in the Winkies was a guy called Philip Rambo, not to be confused with Sylvester Stallone. A very good songwriter, a very good band. They only did one album, which is a bit of a shame, but if you can imagine, I don't know, David Bowie jamming with Brinsley Schwartz, then you're pretty close. The Winkies should have been used, but somehow they got swallowed up by their own identity crisis and by the start of punk. Wow. Who'd have thought it, eh? Another one bites the dust.
To the sound of the beat, another one bites the dust.
And moving on, here's, for a change, here's a band that didn't get wiped out by punk. This is Cochise, who were going, I believe, from 1972 to 1974. So they were gone long before punk started.
Now I'm gone, and now I'm back, and what was white is now turned black, and I'm home again.
They sort of embraced the West Coast sound, because at the time that they were going, the early 1970s, I remember it well, there were a lot of bands going around, like America and people like that, who were like playing this like West Coast. In a way, Chili Willy and the Red Hot Peppers were the best of that lot, and so were Cochise, because their music, the members of the band were like quite amazing. And the one I knew was a guy called BJ Cole, who was Britain's probably premier pedal steel guitarists from the mid-1970s onward. But the guy who played with Matthews at Southern Comfort, who I mentioned as a great guitarist in a previous video, when he died, BJ Cole became the premier pedal steel player, and he played with everyone. I mean, from the Rolling Stones, Van Morrison to, well, you name it. He basically played on everything that you can think of, Elton John, etc. If you like that country sound, like that Poco, that West Coast American sound of the late 60s, early 70s, Cochise would have been for you. They could have been quite big because, like, again, America, people remember, you know, a band with no name. Was it a horse with no name, wasn't it?
First thing I met was a fly with a buzz and the sky with no clouds.
Unfortunately, Cochise never really had a hit, and they drifted apart before they could do anything huge. And the last band we're going to talk about is Plummet Airlines.
And I didn't know that I'd see you in front of me again.
Plummet Airlines came from Nottingham, and they moved to London, and basically they played at the Hope and Anchor, and they were adopted by John Eichler and the people at the Hope and Anchor. And so they even moved in to the pub. So that's how much they were embraced by the Hope and Anchor scene. They were managed by various people, including Jake Riviera and Andrew Jakeman, who's one of the two partners in Stiff Records. Although I believe it was Dave Robinson who gave them a single deal, and their first single was on Stiff Records. There are songs like Silver Shirt and This Is My World that were like very catchy. They could have been hit if it had been 2 or 3 years earlier, because unfortunately, again, they were a band that weren't punk at the time when punk and new wave was everything. Back then, 77 onwards, if you weren't punk or new wave, the record companies weren't that interested. Radio 1 resisted it more than most, but they eventually had to play the Sex Pistols, and then they played obviously XTC and X-Ray Spectrum and that. But there was a time after the BBC embraced punk and it was on the whistle test all the time. Bob Harris was doing the whistle all the time, and he resisted the rise of punk for quite a long time. Retrospectively, it was only a few weeks or months, but at the time it seemed like a long time, because you would switch it on and there'd be all these people with long hair on there doing stuff, and everybody going yawn, 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 because they were out of touch with what was happening. They sort of broke up just as punk started, but all that was left of the Plummet Airlines really are a few John Peel sessions, aside from their 2 singles, of course.
Shingles, schmingles.
So there you have it, 6 great bands that could at a different time, if they'd just been a couple of years earlier or maybe a couple of years later, could have been huge. They were bands who were exciting, they were different to everything, and that might be their problem, I don't know. Back then there were so many great bands, and anyway, stick around with me, subscribe to this channel and watch more of my stuff, and we'll get a flavour of what those times were like together. Thank you for watching. You may like to watch this next. You know, it's something that's been recommended for you. Goodbye.